A confirmation about the audio, please, guys. If the audio is clear and available, kindly confirm. Thank you. We shall be starting in a couple of moments, guys. So, hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's webinar, where we shall be covering the topics which have been relevant for the past week, which have been in news for the past week, and which can be relevant for your examination, both for your prelims as well as for the mains exam. Now, I understand that when we conduct these weekly current affairs webinar, that significantly aids your overall revision of the current affairs as well, what you study in the portion of the newspapers, etc. So carrying on with that trend, here we shall be picking up the articles relevant for the examination from all the various different sources, wherever they appear, and we shall be addressing the topics at large. And what we will ensure in this webinar is, rather than the general trend where we analyze only the prelims type of questions after each of the topic, today we shall have a slight departure from that. And today we shall be discussing these topics, and then we shall be discussing the mains type of questions which can be asked. And very briefly, I shall also be focusing upon how to address answer writing, because answer writing is an issue that many of you have been complaining to us about, that you have or you require a significant amount of improvement to be carried out in that area. So today, as per that requirement, with each of these topics, we shall be stressing upon how to write answers, what kind of questions can be created from these areas. And as we move ahead with the discussion, wherever required, I shall also be able to highlight which are the portions which are relevant for your prelims and which are the portions which are relevant for your mains exam. So let us take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss for today. So today in total, we are going to discuss around 7 topics in detail. So we shall be starting with the community rights and forest conservation. Now, a series of articles have been published in all the various different newspapers, the Hindu, Indian Express, etc., about how the Forest Act Amendment of 2023, how that can lead to a potential curtailment of the rights of the forest dwellers and the tribes in the forested areas. So, what that amendment is about, very briefly, we will cover that. And then we shall be talking about why that is a problematic area for the tribes and also the forest dwellers, and what can be the way forward. Okay, way forward is important to be understood in each of the topics. Then a new program, a mission has been initiated, that is the PMPVTG development mission. This was a mission which was announced actually in the union budget of this year itself, but the actual announcement or the commencement of the program and the mission happened recently on 15th of November. That is again something that we are going to hold up for discussion. What PVTG groups are and what are the issues that they face, that is something that we shall be stressing upon very briefly. Then production gap report has been published. So who publishes this report, what this report is about, and what are India's renewed commitments when it comes to the Paris Agreement 2015 is again something that we are going to discuss. Artificial rains, they have been in news quite significantly, because the creation of these artificial rains has been sought to be done in the region around Delhi in order to combat pollution. So in this, we are going to address what this artificial rain is, what is cloud seeding technology, and whether that can be beneficial overall in order to tackle pollution in the long run or not. So the pros and the cons of it. We understand that artificial rains as a topic has not been covered in significant detail in the previous webinars. So here we are going to cover it in detail. Then the recent civil war and the recent various different clashes on the side of the Myanmar in the region of the Chin province of Myanmar has actually again triggered an influx of migrants in Indian states, particularly in the region around Mizoram. So that again has the potential to trigger the same kind of a crisis that what we observe to be triggered in the region around Manipur with the large influx of migrants from Myanmar. So what is that issue? that again we are going to discuss. And then two of the topics we are going to discuss for international relations. One of them, that India and Australia have been holding the 2+2 dialogue. As we speak, that dialogue process is continuing. So the issues of Quad, SECA, etc. has been in discussion. So what is the relevance of Indian-Australian relationship? What is the relevance of this 2+2? And then eventually we shall be discussing about the China-US summit, which has been held recently in San Francisco on the sidelines of the APEC summit. So what is that APEC summit? And what are the learnings that India can gain upon observing this Chinese American bonhomie, which has been developing in San Francisco? So these are the various different 7 topics that we are going to hold up for detailed discussion. So without further ado, let us straight away jump into the topics. Let us straight away jump into the discussion for the first topic, that is community rights and forest conservation. Now, when we talk about forest conservation, we have various different acts which have been passed through the different ages, through the different years, in order to have the same purpose, that is the conservation of forest. Now, before we come to the amendment which was brought in this year in 2023, which was passed by both the houses of parliament after going through the passage through the Joint Parliamentary Committee, or the JPC route as it is referred to. So after being referred to the Joint Parliamentary Committee, then the bill was introduced into the houses of the parliament, and there it was passed. But there, before going into the details of this Amendment Act 2023, I want you to understand the basic DNA of this Forest Conservation Act, the purpose of it. So you had the Forest Acts which have been passed as early as the 1800s as well. You had an act which was passed way back in 1865 also. But then one of the most instrumental act which was passed regarding forest conservation was the Indian Forest Act of 1927. So the 1927 Act, that was one of the first major legislations. But here you have to understand that the purpose of the Indian Forest Act of 1927 was not so much for the conservation of forest, but more so curtailing the access to these forests for natives. That is, for us Indians, in order to limit our access to the forest, this act was passed. Because for the Britishers, the common understanding was that the forest would have been a very pristine place and an unadulterated, undisturbed region had it not been for us, local people. So that is why they would curtail the access to the forest for the local communities in different areas. It is a different matter and irony for that matter altogether that Britishers single-handedly were responsible and have been responsible for one of the most massive deforestation exercise being carried out in the region of northern part of India, where the entirety of the Himalayan foothills were shaved off very dense and thick forests. The results of which is something that we are able to witness even till today, where we observe disappearance of species such as tigers and even rhinos from the Himalayan foothills, where at one point of time, 100 years back, they were thriving in population. But nonetheless, this Forest Act of 1927 continued to be in place for multiple decades altogether. And then the Stockholm Conference of 1972 happened. I hope we are aware about the Stockholm Conference. So that Stockholm Conference of 1972 was held. Now, this was a conference on man and environment and environmental conservation, protection of environmental resources, conservation of forests, conservation of species, combating climate change. All of these were discussed in this Stockholm conference. Countries such as India had been participant to it. And that is where India basically made it a point after attending this conference that India passed a series of legislations for environmental conservation, be it for the protection of animals, be it for the conservation of forest. And under that obligation and under that trend and pattern, not obligation per se, Stockholm Conference did not have an obligation for the countries, but India, as a responsible member of the International Committee of Nations, we passed the Indian Forest Act of 1980. Now, that was one of the first comprehensive legislations in independent India, which talked about the conservation of forest. And that was quite significant. So, that Forest Conservation Act of 1980 basically talked about the areas which were registered as forest, what kind of access needed to be provided into those areas, what kind of conservation, protection, etc., needed to be provided into those areas. That was done by the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. Now, this has continued. Over a period of time, this act has been amended multiple number of times. The latest amendment has been done in 2023. That is this year. This year, we had the Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023, which was passed. Now, the details of this particular amendment are a bit intriguing. Whereas, because when any act is passed in the parliament, I hope you are aware about this because I understand that you have a significant amount of information about the subject of polity as well. You would have read about how a bill gets passed and how it becomes an act. So basically, when a bill or an act is introduced, you have a preamble to that bill and act which is also given. And that basically talks about what is the purpose or the objective of this amendment being done or being carried out. So, here, as per this Amendment Act, the purpose of it is to help India meet its climate goals. That is the purpose. So, if you have to define the purpose here, what is the purpose of this amendment? So, to meet climate obligations. Climate obligations. And also to increase the green cover. Increase the green cover. Of the country. You have to understand that in the meanwhile, around 1988, India also passed the National Forest Policy. As per the National Forest Policy, India set itself a lofty goal that over the next few years, we will have 1/3 of the geographical area of the country covered under forest. Roughly around 33% of the overall area and aerial coverage of the country will be covered under forest as per the aim set by the National Forest Policy 1988. So, this amendment seeks to fulfill even that purpose. As of now, when we consider the overall forest and tree cover across the country, it is somewhere close to the region around 24.6%. That is the overall coverage. Now, that has to be increased to 33%. Having said that, ever since this Forest Conservation Act of 1980 had been passed, there had been a lot of reservations in various different sectors about how getting clearances in order to divert the forest land or clearances to carry out simple construction in the forested areas, they were becoming incredibly difficult. Files would be pending with the Environment Ministry continuously for many years altogether. And I hope you remember that you had an era which was referred to as the era of policy paralysis. And that was largely caused because of the hiccups in the Environment Ministry, where the ministry would never pass on the files because diverting the land or building even the basic infrastructure, such as, let's say, a bridge across a river which can connect two habitations, even that would be very difficult to carry out if you wanted to carry out a proper connectivity exercise, because it was almost impossible under the rules of this Forest Conservation Act in order to carry out any economic activities, any developmental activities, and the same went for security reasons as well. Because when we take a look at India's present infrastructure building exercise, India presently is amongst those countries of the world which is investing very heavily in increasing the size of infrastructure. We are amongst the largest expanding countries in terms of infrastructural growth. So we have also been doing that across the bordering areas. For example, in the region of Arunachal Pradesh, in the border area of Arunachal Pradesh, we share a kind of a disputed border with China. Now, there is a requirement for infrastructure development there. But because that bordering area is covered under dense vegetation, even that infrastructure building exercise cannot be carried out, could not be carried out. So, because of requirement of economic development, because of requirement of connectivity, because of requirement of security, and in order to promote, let's suppose, activities such as ecotourism, safaris, etc., that was the purpose why this Amendment Act has been passed. So, overall, just a brief preview about the amendment and the key principles of that. So, as per the amendment, the forest law will now apply exclusively to areas categorized under the Forest Act 1927, that the areas which have been identified as being regarded as forest as per the Forest Act 1927, and those designated to be forest after the Forest Act 1980 was passed. The act will not be applicable to forests which were converted to non-forest use on or after 12th of December 1996. Now, this 12th of December 1996 is one of the key issues why the amendment was also sought. Because this was a date for a very landmark Supreme Court judgment, what is also referred to as the Godavarman case. Now, in this Godavarman case, I won't go into the details and the intricacies of what this case was about and what the issues at hand were. Just to give you an overall idea, the litigants who went to the court, they basically talked about the fact that why do we need to carry out the cutting of trees, or in fact deforestation should be stopped regardless of whether an area is defined as a forest or if it is not defined as a forest. Deforestation has to be stopped. Now, the argument from the side of the government was simple, that look, in areas where we have designated the region as a forest, we can obviously prevent deforestation, and there we are taking all the adequate measures to prevent deforestation. But there are a lot of areas under vegetation, private individual forest, estates, etc., where we cannot or we are not in a stage to prevent complete culling of the trees or cutting down of the trees, but there also we can bring some norms. But Supreme Court in that case came up with a kind of a judgment, which basically turned out to be saying that look, when you talk about the term deforestation. So why do you restrict yourself to only those areas which are classified as forest? Deforestation should basically be stopped in all kinds of forest, all kinds of trees. None of the trees should be cut down as much as possible. Now, Supreme Court issued this judgment. The implication of this judgment was huge. Supreme Court went with the dictionary meaning of deforestation. Dictionary meaning of deforestation is what? Cutting down trees in an area of an existing forest land. Now, that forest land can belong to an individual. That forest land can belong to let's say, a corporation. That individual land can belong to a cooperative. So you need to prevent deforestation there also. So what this judgment actually meant, it became almost impossible to carry out any developmental activities, any economic activities in the forested areas. As a result of that, what happened was, and basically, while the urban portion of the country, even the rural portion of the country, they were marching ahead on the developmental parameters, the forested areas, they continue to lack the basic requirements of drinking water, sanitation, road connectivity, etc. Even for healthcare services, those services were denied to the interior of the forest because you could not have infrastructure built. Why? Because for building infrastructure, you would need to clear some forest land. And in order to do that, that was simply not permissible as per the judgment. So there was an increasing clamor call to dilute this Forest Act of 1980. And that is why these amendments were brought into the place, where first of all, it was said that, okay, now the Forest Act will be applicable only in this set of land. For rest of the land, it won't be applicable. So you carry out developmental activities howsoever you wish. But other than that, you also had the fact that it allows the central government to build linear projects in specified manner. It allows the government to carry out certain security specific construction activities, infrastructure building activities near the border. 100 kilometers from the border, that region would be exempt, right? 100 kilometers from border, bordering areas would be exempt. For security and infrastructure, which in a way makes sense also, because when you have the requirement of building, let's suppose, an air base or a military installation, you don't want to be stuck in these environmental clearances for long, because there the strategic importance that takes precedence. But here, that also creates a lot of loophole. For example, if we consider our eastern border, be it the border with Bhutan, be it the border with China in the east, be it the border with Myanmar, be it the border with Bangladesh, we share a large forested tract. So if here that 100-kilometer region from the border is exempt, you are virtually exempting hundreds and thousands of square kilometer of forest area from the purview of this jurisdiction. Now that creates scope for exploitation of the forest land also. Now here, when we talk about this, it also talks about facilitating ecotourism and safari for economic gain. What do we understand by ecotourism? So, ecotourism is that practice where basically you generate that tourism revenue by encouraging footfalls to observe the natural beauty, the natural wonders of an area, the natural diversity of an area, be it maybe a region comprising of diverse ecosystems, diverse kind of vegetation, diverse kind of animal species. So that tourism potential is what needs to be tapped and what the government is seeking to tap out. Okay. Now, here, while the criticism of the Forest Conservation Act, etc., they have been instrumentally discussed quite significantly. But here, what is the concern for the local population? Why is it that the local population is actually concerned? And in fact, the activists all around, they are raising their voices that how this can basically end up destroying their lives and livelihoods. So one has to understand that in order to carry out any activity in the forested area, the general trend and practices, and even as per the requirement of the FRA, the Forest Rights Act, that grants the rights to the forest dwellers and the local tribal population living in that area, they get that right as per the FRA, right? So even as per the requirement of FRA, in order to carry out any activity prior to that, you need to get clearance from the Gram Sabha. Gram Sabha. That Gram Sabha clearance will basically ensure that you have a kind of an agreement with all the local population and also the population on the ground, basically, the tribes in that region. Now, with this particular act being passed, with various areas being exempted from clearance, with central government getting the overarching power in order to divert a particular forest land, so thereby it is a significant amount of doubt. There is a significant amount of doubt which is cast upon the fact that this prior consent might not be required anymore. And it is not only as per this particular act, but activists, what they have pointed out, that there has been a trend, and this is important to note. There has been a trend for the past 10 years and more, where different states, they have basically tried to dilute the rights provided to the forest dwellers, provided to the tribes, and they have tried to divert the forest land by diluting the process of requirement. So there is already a process which is diluting their role. And this act is supposed to push that over the edge. Now, potential environmental implications will be huge because many of these forested areas, they are actually regions of critical habitat. Now, in that area, if you carry out construction activities, fair enough. That construction activity may be a bridge, maybe a sanitation system, maybe a drinking water supply. While that can change the livelihoods in the region, but if not carried out sustainably and responsibly, that has got the potential to disturb the entire ecosystem of that area. And the forest dwellers, the tribes, they basically depend on that ecosystem. Their survivability is dependent on that ecosystem. So once that ecosystem is disturbed, well, the lifestyle in itself is disturbed. Rights granted under the Forest Rights Act, FRA, are being diluted by the states by converting the land into non-forest land, first of all. So what the modus operandi of the states has been, so what the and how the states have been operating is because this understand the states also require capital investment, they also require some economic development happening in a region, so they cannot divert the forest land. So what they do, first of all, let's suppose here you have a this much area to be declared as forest land. Now a part of it they will declare as non-forest land, right? And after it is declared as non-forest land, then after that divert it for capital investment. So this has been the modus operandi, the method of operation which the various state governments are indulging in. So this particular act again seems to hasten the process. And understand, when you are carrying out these activities, for example, you have the Kane Betwa interlinking project which is being carried out. I hope we are aware, where the excess water from one of these channels is sought to be transferred into a deficit region, and the rivers of Kane and Betwa are being interlinked by construction of a canal. Now, that construction has to go through the Panna Biosphere Reserve, which is a critical habitat for the tiger population. Panna Biosphere Reserve is one of those areas which has actually witnessed a slight decline in the tiger population as compared to the last census. Now, if you carry out construction activities in these areas, naturally, the wildlife will be driven into the regions of human habitation. And once the wildlife is driven to the human habitation, what will happen? Man animal conflict. And whenever man animal conflict happens, eventually it is the animal which loses out. And in case of the forest dwellers, eventually it is the man also which loses out. So these are some of the particular set of concerns. But then moving ahead, going ahead, whenever you talk about the forest conservation and any amendment which has to be passed, there are set of challenges that one needs to address. For example, ensuring a qualitative increase in forest cover to meet climate goals. How do you do that? We have to do that. So if, let's suppose, if we go by the current trends, that is not happening to the rate at which it has been expected to happen. So this is a kind of a drawback for that matter. Currently, we have 24.6%, almost, it is close to around 24.56, 24.6% of area under forest. And this has to be taken to 33%. So there is a long way to go. So how do you bring about an increase in the forest area if you are making norms which ease the diversion of the forest land? Then bringing reforms in compensatory afforestation programs is also required. What is this compensatory afforestation, by the way? For example, let's suppose you are an individual and an organization who has carried out deforestation in this particular region, right? You have cut down the trees in order to maybe construct a highway or something. Now, as per the stipulation, as per the requirement, let's suppose you have cleared an area of 1 square kilometer. Just as an example, you have to deposit some amount of fund to the state coffers also. And along with that, you have to ensure afforestation. That is, you have to plant trees as a compensation for that area. Now, this compensatory afforestation has got its own set of problems. For example, let's suppose I clear an area where you have very dense forest. Very dense forest. Now, when we talk about very dense forest, we are talking about trees in very close vicinity, a very unique kind of an ecosystem, right? And that develops naturally over the period of multiple years. That is how very dense forests are in existence. In India, very dense forest, anyways, they are not present in many areas. It is almost around 3 to 4% of the geographical area is covered under very dense forest. So, let's suppose I cut the trees in very dense forest. I have to carry out afforestation. Generally, you will find that when afforestation is carried out, this is, if suppose afforestation is carried out in this plot of land, you will have trees which are planted in kind of rows and columns, very similar to that of a garden or a botanical garden of sorts. Now, understand, almost a similar area you are covering under trees as compensation. But then, here, will that serve as a purpose of a very dense forest? Obviously not. Will this be able to handle the critical ecosystem that a very dense forest handles? Obviously not. So, this is where very dense forest in our country, which actually consist of many of these forest dwellers, increasingly they are being replaced by such kind of forested landscape, which on the face of it can be referred to as a forest land, but doesn't solve that many purpose. So that is a challenge that we need to address moving ahead. And the project's clearance when it is provided, rather than ensuring in these acts that, okay, these projects don't require clearance, this project also doesn't require clearance, rather than doing that, ensure that the clearance mechanism is fast paced, ensure that the clearance mechanism is transparent, so that there is no scope for discretion. Whenever the scope for discretion comes into play, there is corruption and there is policy impediment which also comes into place. So this needs to be tackled moving ahead. Okay. Now, before moving into the question here, I want to have a brief analysis and a brief summary of everything that we have discussed in this topic in detail. So in this topic, what is it that we have discussed? We have discussed what is this Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023. Before that, we have discussed the genesis of these forest acts, right from 1927 to 1980 to the National Forest Policy of 1988. That what has been the origin in the terms of the lines of thinking, how this has come into existence. That is something that we have discussed. And then we have discussed the key principles of this amendment, why they are problematic, what is the purpose of this amendment being provided. Then we have discussed how the community rights of the local population, of the tribal population, of the forest dwellers, how that can get impacted, both by the acts of the state government as well as the central government. We have discussed what was that Godavarman case, which has brought about a lot of impediments and a lot of demands in order to dilute that forest act. What is it that the states are doing in order to dilute the forested land? Then we have discussed what are the challenges which confront us when it comes to the forest conservation in our country. So these are the areas that we have discussed. That is more than sufficient to address a question being asked either for the prelims or the mains portion. However, to be very honest, this is a portion which is absolutely relevant for your mains exam. This is a kind of a question that you find, analytical kind of a question that you find to be asked in the mains exam as well as in the interview process. Okay, now let us analyze the question which can be asked and how to write the answer. Discuss the implications of the Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023 and the potential impact on the tribal population. So, how do you write this answer? So, in the introduction here, straightforward. Introduction has to follow from the main aspect of the question. What is the main aspect of the question? Main aspect of the question is not the implication on tribal population. Main aspect is implications of the act. So here, in the introduction, you have to write the about the fact that Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023 was passed in order to, and here you have to talk about the goals of this act. What were the goals? You don't have to say that, okay, this has been a disastrous move, etc. No. You have to talk about what were the goals of the act. So, what were the goals? To help India meet the Paris commitments and also to increase the green cover as per our national forest policy. So, this Forest Conservation Act 2023, Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023, has been cleared by both the houses of the parliament in order to facilitate India's requirement or India's goal of the coverage of forested area as well as the uh, commitments that India made at the Paris Agreement. So that will be your brief introduction. Then after that, when you start the body portion, here you have to talk about the key amendments. Ideally, I would advise you that list them out in a bullet point manner and basically wherever required write a couple of sentences, but that's it. Now once you have done this, then after that, because you have to talk about the key implications of it, talk about the implications. And here I would advise you to go for a kind of a representative or a kind of a better presentation aspect where you can talk about both the positive implications and the negative implications. Form such columns, positive and negative implications, right? So both of them, you point it out. Positive implications, security concerns can be addressed at the border areas, vital infrastructure can be built connecting the habitats, ensuring basic necessities of life such as drinking water supply, etc. So these are your positive implications. Negative implications, on the other hand, we have talked about diversion of forest land, we have talked about pollution, we have talked about the implication on the local population, the implication on the wildlife, man animal conflict, all of that you can summarize in brief 2 to 3 points that you can list it out. Okay. Now, after this, then come to the issues faced by the tribal population of forest dwellers. And here, what do you write? So here, basically, again, if you are falling short of words and time, always advisable that simply underline this, draw this, and then write various different bullet points. What are the issues that they are facing? So what are the issues that they are facing? That the prior consent norm from the Gram Sabha is being diluted over a period of time. And this particular act further hastens that process of the local population being exempted from giving clearances or making them a part of that clearance process. Then talk about the fact that how the states have been diluting the FRA in order to reduce the role of the local population in the control of the forest. Talk about increasing man animal conflict. Talk about disturbance of the critical habitats. Talk about the infrastructure. Everything that you have talked about in the issues, you can list it out. Then comes the time of way forward and conclusion. So, in this type of a question, always advisable that conclusion should basically appear to be very similar to how you provide a way forward. So, India needs to combat climate change, and for that, forests are the most powerful weaponry in our arsenal. Conservation of forest should not only be a legislative obligation, should but rather should be a national duty, as has been also defined in Part 4 of the Constitution, Part 4A of the Constitution. Right? Now, conservation of forest also requires ensuring and respecting the rights of the local population of the tribes and the forest dwellers, ensuring them a greater say or ensuring a greater say in the decisions made for the forest conservation will ensure sustainability in conservation, protection, and also requirement of the basic ecosystem services, helping the local population fulfill their own demands moving ahead into the future. So in this way, when you are writing the conclusion, you are talking about both the conservation of forest as well as protection of the tribal rights. So that is how ideally you should conclude this answer of 250 words. I hope that is understood. Okay. Now, after this, we move to the second particular article. So, in face value, this act is about forest conservation, but it has loopholes as pointer. Yes, which that is correct. Yes, Anjali, it is. Afforestation and reforestation, the basic differences. When we talk about afforestation, you are generally planting trees in a newer area. You are bringing cultivation and vegetation, or you are bringing that vegetation of into a newer area. Reforestation, a region where a forest has been degraded or deforested, in that area itself you are planting those trees. So that is the difference. Okay. Is this amendment aimed to tackle the issue of Naxalism and insurgents? That is not termed as the primary goal or the aim as introduced as this bill was introduced. But then here, the government during the various debates also talked about the fact, and this was also presented in the Joint Parliamentary Committee, that building of that critical infrastructure in areas such as Gadchiroli, in areas of the Red Corridor, will help combat the left-wing extremist elements also. So that was the security concerns talked about both the external as well as the internal security. Yes. Okay. Uh, right. I hope that is understood. Now, moving ahead to the next article, and that is the PM PVTG Development Mission. Now, recently, you had the Prime Minister's visit to the state of Jharkhand, and on this occasion of his visit, he basically inaugurated this PM PVTG Development Mission. Now, PVTG Development Mission was actually announced in the union budget of this year itself, where there was a demarcation of fund close to around 15,000 crore allocated for the development of these PVTGs. PVTGs basically the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So for their development, 15,000 crore sum was earmarked. But then it has been launched now on 15th of November with a sum or a budgetary sum and a budgetary allocation of 24,000 crore. You have close to around 9 ministries which are involved in this particular development program, including the sanitation, housing, and so on. So here, this is aimed to improve the socio-economic conditions of the PVTGs, that is the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now, this is a question which has been asked by the government, by the UPSC before as well, about the PVTGs, the number of PVTGs that you have. That is a question which was asked because this was in news prior. Now, the mission envisages the availability of 24,000 crore of budgetary support from the Development Action Plan for the scheduled tribes for activities to be undertaken in 3 years under the mission. Again, these are relevant factual trivia for your prelims. Now, here, if you observe that, what is to be done in this? So, when we talk about PVTGs, the vulnerable tribal groups, they suffer from various different issues. Issues such as lack of development, right? Lack of the protection of their culture and tradition, the loss of the living spaces, the loss of community structure, lack of proper integration and assimilation in the society to ensure mainstreaming, availability of proper health care. So these are the various issues that they face. So in order to ward off or in order to tackle these issues, this particular mission talks about the development of basic necessities such as roads, development of basic necessities such as telecom, electricity, housing, so as to provide that basic conditions of living. Because in majority of these areas where the PVTGs are present, and I will give you the list of the PVTGs as well for your perusal and for your reference later on. But basically, when we talk about all the areas where you will have high dominance of PVTGs, be it in the region of Jharkhand, be it in the region of Madhya Pradesh, in Chhattisgarh, in Odisha, you'll find that in these areas, the social indicators, the health indicators, for example, the educational parameters, they are not doing particularly good. if you consider the infant mortality, if you consider institutional delivery of newborn, if you consider maternal health and maternal mortality, if you consider the percentage of women suffering from anemia, if you consider the number of children suffering from acute form of malnutrition or undernourishment, these areas are lacking behind. And it is due to the underdevelopment or complete lack of development in these areas, which has exaggerated and exacerbated our rural problems overall when taken on a country average. So that is what is sought to be dispelled by this particular mission. So it has basically targeting of 75 PVTGs in 18 states and UTs, living in close to around 22,000 villages, 22,500 villages. So overall, it talks about the development on 11 critical interventions through 9 different ministries. Now, you don't have to memorize what the ministries are, but ideally, you should be aware that what are the activities covered under this. Because you can have a prelims type of a question which can be framed. For example, in order to facilitate the development of PVTGs, the PVTG development mission talks about development of super specialty hospitals. That will be incorrect. So, what does that developmental plan talk about? So, yeah, understand. It has to be covered under basic facilities. You are providing the basic facilities to allow them, to basically encourage them to live a particular set or a basic minimal standard of life. So, what do you do? Safe housing. Once you provide housing or shelter, automatically a lot of problems are taken care of. But then clean drinking water, which will in a way improve the quality of life, get rid of the diseases, and improve the sanitation facilities also. Improved access to education, health and nutrition, road and telecom connectivity, and sustainable livelihood opportunities. These are the developmental programs which have been covered. Okay. Now, overall, other than this, also, for example, in the tribal areas, you have already various different programs being carried out. For example, in the tribal regions, I'm sure you would be aware of the fact that in order to help education of the tribal kids and the tribal population, you have the Eklavya model schools which are being operated. I hope we are aware of that. Eklavya model schools for education in tribal areas. So already you have these activities being carried out, midday meal schemes, etc., are being run. You have basically the provision being carried out in order to ensure that the social sector schemes they reach there. But then still there are large gaps. For example, Anganwadis, the Anganwadi workers, who basically ensure a greater help to the maternal health, also the infant health. And Anganwadi workers, basically, nowadays, what they have become, Anganwadis, Asha workers, they basically have become a medium, a conduit to carry the benefits of the government programs right to the grassroots. So, as per this particular developmental mission, even those Anganwadi workers will be provided, or you will have more Anganwadi workers working in these areas also to shed the light of development in these regions as well. So increased access to Anganwadis, right? Or increased role of Anganwadis. All of this is being done. But then the PVTGs which are spread across the country, what are they? Now this is relevant for your prelims. And this has been asked previously in prelims as well. So PVTGs, it has been understood that you have various different tribal population across the country, Asurs, Mundas, or different types of tribal population across the country, which basically they have a significant In a way, when we talk about social and economic backwardness, they are significantly backward. And also, they live as one with the nature, with the environment. Development and light of development has not reached them. Most of them, they carry out primitive activities or primary sector jobs, and not jobs in a way, but many of them still carry out hunting and gathering. Shifting kind of cultivation is carried out, so they don't have much of an economic prospect as well. So there is poverty, there is lack of education, there is lack of availability of health condition or health intervention, there is lack of basic necessities in these areas. So these particular tribes, it was felt that they need to be protected. So that is why during the fourth 5 year plan, a subcategory was created within the scheduled tribes in itself to identify the most vulnerable groups which were considered to be at the lowest level of development. It has to be understood and appreciated that while the constitution makers themselves had talked about that how the socially and economically and backward sections of the society need to be handheld, need to be provided support from the state at various different levels. But even within that tribal community, you had those which were much more backward than rest of the tribes. They were put under PVTGs. Debhar Commission was set up. And as per the recommendation of Debhar Commission, you had four parameters based upon which a community was described as a PVTG. So, for example, pre-agricultural level of technology, very primitive technology, very low output, completely dependent only on nature, low level of literacy, almost absent, economic backwardness, quite significant, lack of economic opportunities, and a declining or a stagnant population. This will happen in case when you don't have health facilities, in case when you don't have economic opportunities. So what will that lead to? That will lead to higher death rate, isn't it? Death rate will be very high. Infants won't survive quite significantly, and that means the population won't increase, the population would be stagnating or reducing. In the tribal population across the region of Andaman Nicobar, there also you have PVTGs. Now in many of these the population has been shrinking because of this basic factor. And it is not a rocket science, it is very simple phenomena. If you provide medicine, nutrition, healthcare, people live longer. When people live longer, generally the population expands. If you don't provide them, if you don't have access to them, and in the modern day and age when outside world connectivity is so significant, you can be introduced to a particular kind of virus which your entire community might never have been introduced to. You have many different tribes which have perished basically because of introduction of virus such as common cold. So you can understand that these tribal groups, they are very, very vulnerable. Now, by the way, who declares these groups as PVTGs? It is not the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, by the way. These groups are declared by Ministry of Home Affairs, right? So basically this is done by the Ministry of Home Affairs. Again, relevant for your prelims. You can have a prelims type of a question frame from here, that who declares these groups as PVTGs. Now, as per the census exercise of 2011, obviously, census exercise after that has not been carried out. It has been postponed. As per this census exercise, you had 75 PVTGs, right? Out of the total 705 scheduled tribes, 75 were basically PVTGs, which was spread over 17 states and UTs, right? And here PVTGs of Sentinelese and Andamanese, which are found in the region of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, North Sentinel Island, where you will find the Sentinelese population. They have a very limited population of double digits. It is this population which is endangered. It is this population which is at a risk of extinction. And they have not had connectivity with the outside world for many thousands of years. So that is why even a genuine connectivity of an individual reaching that might mean that if, let's suppose, I go there, now I might have multiple different pathogens within my system, and my system has grown immune to it over a period of thousands of years. Our body has grown immune to it. but their body hasn't. So when they are exposed to that same risk, they basically can be exposed to the risk of death as well, because a common flu might kill them, right? So Odisha has the highest number of PVTGs in India, while no PVTGs are found in the states of Punjab and Haryana. When we talk about the PVTG population in the various states, these are your various different PVTGs. You don't have to particularly memorize this. This is just for your information sake. So, for example, if you observe, you have Kathodi, Kovalia, all these in Gujarat. Then you have Koraga in Karnataka. Then, for example, you have Abuj Marias, you have Baigas, Barias in the region of Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. Then, for example, you have Saharias in the region of Rajasthan. Similarly, in the case of Tamil Nadu, you have Todas, you have Irulas. Now, what you should do is take a glance through it. Okay, while carrying out a revision, take a glance through it. Go through each and every name, not particularly to learn it off, but whenever for the next year or couple of years or 3 years, whenever it has to be or it is coming in the news stories or current affairs, immediately pick it out. Because many of the times it happens that in the current affairs they will say that, okay, this tribal population is impacted, they will not mention that it is a PVTG, and a question can be framed from here. Question has been framed about the Irulas, the questions has been framed about the Todas, the question has been framed in the prelims about the PVTG population also, where in 2019 UPSC put up a straightforward question about how many number of PVTGs are there as per the 2011 census. So that also you should be in a position to address. Okay. Now, Great Andamines, Jaravas, Sentinelese, these are the names that you come across quite frequently. So that is why I want you to get familiar with these names. And you also have to understand the issues faced by the PVTG. So what are the issues faced? First of all, when we talk about the issues, you have limited economic source. Piyush, these tribals in Bihar and Jharkhand were involved in revolt against the British in tribal revolt. Yes, they were. How many PVTGs are in India right now? We will go with the 2011 census only, 75. Okay. So there would be a concern if birth rate is declining or stagnating and longevity of people increases. Yes. So here, other issues. What are the other issues that are faced? Then limited scope for health interventions, loss of tradition, a traditional culture and livelihood, loss of living spaces, lack of assimilation, with the outside world, lack of contemporary education, right? And lack of institutional support, exploitation at the hands of middlemen. Okay. On which parameters identifying them as PVTG, Srilata, that is what we discussed, isn't it? That as per the Debhar committee recommendations, where if let's suppose they are using pre-agricultural technology, if the education level, literacy level is very low, if there is a stagnating or declining population, that is also an issue. So this also you can talk about declining population. Okay, so based on those parameters, so that is why Srilata, you will observe that as per the last census, you had 705 scheduled tribes, only 75 PVTGs, right? So on those parameters of social and culture, social and economic backwardness, then as per the recommendations of the Debar Commission, on that basis, the names are recommended to the Ministry of Home Affairs, and then they basically decide whether it can be categorized as a PVTG or not. Which commission? Debhar Commission. I had listed it out here. This is the criteria. These are the 4 criteria. Okay. I hope that is clear. Now, yes, Vivek, that is correct. Almost no institutional support, almost no governmental support. So these are the various issues which are faced. And by providing the basic necessities of life, the basic developmental parameters, we can address these issues. We can ensure that they also develop at the same rate. Okay. Now, this is a question which can be framed. What are the PVTGs? What are PVTGs? How can PVTG development mission help overcome the problems faced by these tribal groups? Now, this is a two-part question, right? And this is only of 10 marks, that is 150 words. So in this introduction, when you write this introduction here, you have to talk about, in the introduction, you have to address this particular part, the first part of the question. What are PVTGs, or who are these PVTGs, right? So that you can discuss, or that you can talk about, that the particularly vulnerable tribal groups are amongst those population of the scheduled tribes in the country, which due to their declining population, due to the low level of literacy and significant and substantial level of backwardness, have been deemed to be particularly vulnerable and require some amount of protection. That's it. Then in the body part, you can talk about that how these PVTGs, they are spread over the entirety of the country, almost 17 states and UTs. You have 75 PVTGs as per the 2011 census. The population is significantly larger in the states such as Odisha, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh, and the population is very low in the region around Andaman Nicobar, the region around Punjab and Haryana have almost no population of these PVTGs. So here you are talking about the PVTG population. How can this development mission help? So immediately after that, in the body itself, talk about the developmental mission, talk about the budgetary outlay, talk about the basic necessities which are to be fulfilled, and then talk about how it will improve the health standard, the median age of living, life expectancy, level of education, all that you can then talk about. Eventually, in the conclusion, you have to talk about that the basic necessities of life will help them achieve their own potential, or will help them capitalize on their own potential, and will help them assimilate. uh, Assimilate, basically get together and commingle, so assimilate with the larger society, and to ensure the development of the future generations as well, while retaining the basic characteristics and the basic cultural traditions of those tribal groups. So that is how you can end the answer. Okay. Now, moving on to the next topic. And this is a topic relevant only for your prelims, mostly relevant only for your prelims, that the Production Gap Report 2022 has been released. So here, what is first of all important is to understand what is this Production Gap Report talking about, and then what this report, or who brings that particular report. So when we talk about this report, it has been published by the Stockholm Environment Institute. The Production Gap Report 2023, which was published last week itself, is published by which particular institute? So this is relevant for your prelims. So UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, is one of those instrumental platforms and agencies. Okay, so this can be asked straightforward. So, Climate Analytics, E3G, International Institute for Sustainable Development, these are the institutions which are basically involved in commissioning of this particular report. Now, what does this report talk about? So basically, all the various different countries, they have made their own pledge as per the Paris Agreement to curtail the level of emissions, for example, to ensure that they will become cleaner in terms of the emission standards, to ensure that the air or the pollution will be controlled, and to ensure their switch to cleaner modes of energy in order to sustain the level of production and also in order to mitigate the dangers of climate change. Having said that, when we talk about production of fossil fuel, utility of crude oil, etc., that has been increasing. And that in itself does not go hand in hand with the goals that the countries have set as per the Paris Agreement. India has also been a signatory to Paris Agreement. India has also made a set of declarations as per the Paris Agreement. And as per the declarations that India has made, India has, by the way, managed to fulfill the nationally determined contributions that India had pledged at Paris. And it is amongst the only major economies to have achieved that. And along with that, it has also went ahead and India has basically updated its own NDCs. So this report assesses the government's planned and projected production of coal, oil and gas against the global levels consistent with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. What is the temperature goal? So the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement is that we have to limit the warming to 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial level. And the ambitious goal is that we have to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial level. But in order to limit that level of warming, we need to curtail the burning of these fossil fuel, such as coal and oil. Now, how will that happen if the countries continue to produce this and if the countries continue to use this also? So, this report has particularly indicated here when we talk about the global fossil fuel production. Understand this. Now, here in this, what are the plans that the various different governments and the various different national governments and nations they are pursuing? So, as per that, here this is the emitted level of emission or the expected estimated level of emissions. Whereas what is required to be done, as per the stated policy, it should have followed this curve. But we are well on top of that, right? As per the stated policy. Now, as per the pledges that the countries have made as per the Paris Agreement, this should be the utilization of these fossil fuels. But the projection is what? That we are moving in this pattern. And if we have to ensure that the planet doesn't warm by more than 2 degrees Celsius, the utility pattern and the emission pattern has to follow this particular pathway. For 1.5 degrees C warming, that it has to follow this pathway. So you can see that there is a significant gap in what is required to be done and what is being done. So that gap is highlighted by this production gap report. So you have these reports: emission gap report, production gap report, right? Adaptation gap report. These are the reports which are frequently released. And the purpose of it is to highlight that what is required by the world to do in order to commit to the climate actions and what the world is actually doing. So here there's a large gap which is in existence for the utility and the production of crude oil, coal, natural gas as compared to what is required by the government. Now here, if you observe the key findings here, you will observe that even for that matter, while majority of the countries they are harking down upon the coal production, they are basically trying to limit the coal production being carried out. But then here, even in the case of coal production, you will observe a kind of a spike. Why is that? Because of what is happening. For example, after Russia Ukraine war broke out, for example, now Germany is a country in Europe which is requiring high amounts of energy, which requires high amount of energy for its industrial purposes, for the energy requirements during the harsh winter season, etc. Now, Germany used to get a lot of this energy from nuclear power and also from rooftop solar. But ever since that Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan took place, Germany basically decided that we will shut down all the nuclear power plants. So it shut down all the nuclear power plants. And then countries in Europe and Germany, they were relying upon the Russian gas, the gas provided by Russia, the natural gas being provided by Russia in order to carry out their requirements for the fulfillment of energy. As soon as the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, all these European countries, they curtailed Russian gas import, but they required that energy. So what would they do? They started burning coal. They started importing and burning coal. So thereby, you can understand that while in the long run, the utility of coal will definitely decline because of how polluting a source of energy it is. But in the short run, it is indicating a spike, which in itself is quite dangerous. Now, when we talk about, let's suppose, the oil production, despite the adoption of electric vehicles, the advent of newer technology, the oil production continues to go high, and so is the case with the gas production as well. So that is where you have an increase as compared to what is required. So the projection exceeds the 2 degrees Celsius target by around 69%, emphasizing the need for an urgent climate action. Major producer countries, they basically have pledged to achieve the net zero emission condition. What is net zero emission again? When we talk about the concept of net zero emission, what is that? So basically, this aims to sequester the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that has been emitted by any particular country. So, amount of CO2 equivalent emitted same amount to be absorbed and sequestered. So various different countries, they have announced their net zero emission targets. India has also announced it to be 2070. But as per those targets, the paths that they need to take, they are not doing that. And in fact, they are increasing this kind of production. They are increasing this emission also. India has also updated the NDCs, by the way. And there, India has basically ensured emission reduction, where the India's nationally determined contribution, NDCs basically stand for nationally determined contributions. Okay, so India's NDC aims to cut emission intensity by 45% by 2030, and it targets 50% non fossil fuel power capacity by 2030, and overall to strive towards a 2070 net zero emission goal. Now, India, given the fact that how much we are stressing upon the requirement of renewables, how much we are stressing upon green hydrogen, we will achieve that net zero emission target. But when it comes to other major economies, economies in Europe, economies in western part of the world, economies such as China, that is where this production gap report is particularly highlighting. So define the findings of the production gap report. Where does India stand in terms of its commitments to meet the obligation under the Paris Agreement? So here again, in the introduction, you have to address the first part of it, that what is that forest gap report. So forest gap report is published by UNEP along with these particular institutions. That is something that you have to understand. That is something that you have to keep in mind. Even if, let's suppose, you're not able to learn all of those particular things, at least be familiar to that, so that if an objective question is framed, you'll be able to pick it out. And then talk about the fact that what the findings indicate, that the overall production curve is very high as compared to the government stated policies, as compared to 2 degrees C warming requirement, as compared to 1.5 degrees C warming requirement, provide a kind of a rough curve or a rough graph also. Then in the body portion, where does India stand? So what is the requirement as per the Paris Agreement? To limit the warming to 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial era. And for that, you do need basically the fact of limiting the amount of emissions. So you have the NDCs being announced by the various different nations and the governments. So what these NDCs are, what have been India's NDCs. So that's is something you have to highlight. Okay. Now, then we come to the portion of artificial rains in Delhi. Right? Doesn't this global stock take report? Vikram, basically, even if you consider emission gap report, global stock take report, adaptation gap report, most of them they revolve around the same thing. But here the difference is production gap report particularly focuses upon the fossil fuel, right? Global stock take, etc., they talk about the energy sector. But this particularly talks about the fossil fuel. That is the nuanced. Okay. Sabha, today is Tuesday. Why are you giving all the mains questions? I understand, Sabha, that there has been a trend to discuss the prelims questions only on Tuesday. This year, this week in particular, we are having a departure from that because many of you had highlighted that you need an idea about the answer writing as well. I'm sure from next week onwards, we will be able to revert to the normal practice of prelims discussion again. Sometimes there are two questions, there are some questions in which we have to address two or more subparts of the question. What do we have to write for conclusion? So for that particular portion, the conclusion that you have to write is always going to be addressing the second part of the question. Mostly the second part of the question is the determining factor there. Okay. And is it better to note down these topics? Always better, my dear friend. 2023. It is 2023, Ashwin. And Saima, can you please write one answer as a sample from any topic within 7 minutes so that we can learn? Try to write it down on your own, my dear friend. Have some where you are working for or you are struggling for civil services examination. This is not the board examination that you are working for. If I write it down a particular answer, how is that going to help you out? So please try to frame it. Please understand, don't be afraid to commit mistakes. Don't be afraid to write bad answers as of now. If that is the worry that the answer that I will write will be so bad that maybe UPSC will be angry at me, don't be worried about it. Write the answers. What is the worst? They will give you 0 in the evaluation right now when you send it for evaluation. Don't worry. Incorporate the comments, improve the answers. I don't think me writing the answer or me writing the essay for that matter, regardless of how much that you want, that is not going to solve any purpose. Right? Now, artificial rains in Delhi. Now, this is a topic which has been in discussion for some time now. As we speak, November 20th and 21st were scheduled to be those days when Delhi would have experienced or there would have been an experimental causation of artificial rains in Delhi. Now, what is the purpose of this? Why is it that people want this artificial rain to happen? The purpose is very simple. When we talk about atmosphere in Delhi right now, pollution is the most prevalent problem. And that is something where Delhi has made global headlines in the past few years during these months. Now, when we talk about air pollutants, you have the pollutants amongst the various gases. You also have amongst the pollutants PM 2.5 and PM 10. Now, what does PM stand for? This is basically particulate matter. So when we talk about PM10 or PM2.5, we are talking about the size of it, the microns, right? PM10, 10 micron size, PM2.5, 2.5 micron size. Now, PM10 is not that dangerous as compared to PM2.5 because PM10 Even if you try to inhale, the mucus layer of your nasal membrane, that will basically stop that PM 2.5. So it won't enter your respiratory tract, but PM 2.5 can enter. And that is what causes respiratory illnesses. Now, when you cause or when you experience rainfall in any area, let's suppose in this area there is natural rainfall. Now, the general aspect of functioning is that this rainwater carries away the PM10, dissolves that PM10 and carries it away. So it makes the air cleaner. 10th of November was when, 8th or 10th of November was when Delhi received some rainfall, which provided some relief from the otherwise very bad state of pollution. But there also, you have an issue. PM10, while that you can address, PM 2.5, that still remains in the atmosphere even after that rainfall. So, this is something that we have to think about going forward. But in order to get rid of these problems, that is why you have certain researchers from IIT Kanpur who have basically demonstrated this activity of artificial rains, and they have basically proposed to carry out the artificial rains by cloud seeding technique in the region of Delhi. It is a different matter altogether that it has been put off, it has been delayed for another week. But then, what is this? So, the government has been mulling the use of artificial rain through cloud seeding to combat air pollution crisis in the national capital. So, what is this cloud seeding and what is this concept of artificial rain? So, cloud seeding. So, it is the process of artificially generating rain, and that process involves implanting the clouds with particles such as silver iodide crystals, potassium iodide, and dry ice, relevant both for prelims as well as mains. Now, what does this process do? Let us try to understand that. What is this entirety of the process? Very quickly, if you browse through it, an aircraft injects these particular substances, silver iodide, potassium iodide, anything, into the air, and then the chemicals mimic the particles that serve as a surface for condensation to happen, and eventually rainfall will happen. But let us break this down. So what is done is you have aircrafts generally for cloud seeding aircrafts are used. Some you have some technologies where you also have a ground cannon like structure from the ground itself. You basically inject that or release that silver iodide that high into the atmosphere, but that is not very efficient. That is why people use aircrafts. So aircrafts are used with flares and with silver iodide. Now, this silver iodide, so as the aircraft flies over a particular region, let's suppose you have an aircraft moving over a particular area. Okay, let's suppose you have an aircraft which is moving over a particular area. Now, as this aircraft is moving over here, it will spray these silver iodide crystals. Dry ice is, what is dry ice? Are we aware of dry ice? No? Good. No, dry ice is not frozen ice. Dry ice is solid CO2. Good. Majority of you have given the correct answer. So, they spray this silver iodide. Now, as most of you would be aware of it, even if you are not aware, understand, for condensation to happen, you do need a surface, any surface. Condensation can never happen without any surface. I will repeat. For condensation to happen, you do need a surface. So even for example, when you take out a bottle from the refrigerator, you keep it on the table. It is the condensation which happens on the sidelines of the bottle. If let's suppose you carry that bottle away, no condensation will happen there. Right? So always a surface is required. Cloud formation happens by the process of condensation itself. Condensation, eventually it is a water vapor in an area. Let's suppose in an area you have the presence of that water vapor, and that water vapor is rising up. Now, unless and until a surface is there, you won't have condensation happening. So that is why what is done. So when you have the dust particles in the atmosphere, these dust particles oftentimes they provide that surface for condensation to happen. But then, not many of the times you have thick clouds which will develop. So when you install or spray these particular particles at lower temperature, these particles provide the surface with very low temperature. So particles of silver iodide, of for example, silver iodide I'm taking as an example, provide a cold surface for condensation. Right? They serve as a nuclei for that condensation. Now, around these particles, immediately the water vapor, when it gets in contact with these particles, which get very cold, so this water vapor can get converted into ice crystals. Now, understand or imagine, for example, here you have an ice crystal which is formed. Here also, let's suppose you have an ice crystal which is formed. Now, the surface of ice crystal, will that be cold? Obviously, yes. So that ice crystal will again provide a surface for further condensation to happen. Its size will grow. Then again, this will also provide a surface for condensation to happen. The size will grow. Nearby, again, another condensation will happen. Size will grow. So what it means is that in areas where you have the presence of some water vapor, but there is not rainfall which is happening, by this technique, you lead to the formation or you encourage the formation of such larger ice particles in the clouds, which become eventually heavier and they fall as raindrops. But this rainfall is not happening naturally out there, is it? Had these particles not been injected, rainfall would not have happened. So that is why it is an artificial rain. And that is why it is cloud seeding. Because in an existing cloud structure, in order to accelerate the rate of condensation, understand, in an existing cloud structure, you spray this so that you accelerate the rate of condensation, the formation of larger ice crystals, so that earlier, if you had a cloud which did not bring rainfall, now that cloud will bring lot of rains. So that is the process of cloud seeding and artificial rains. Now, this is a technology which was developed by the US military decades back. And obviously, in order to have that strategic advantage during Cold War, these technologies would be developed. But for the first time, internationally, in terms of the international glare, are we aware where was it utilized, this concept of artificial rain? It was utilized in 2008 when Beijing was to hold the Olympics. Now, 2008 Olympics held in Beijing was China's moment on the world stage. And China did not want to spoil it. China, in fact, wanted to display to the world that look what 3 decades of stupendous growth has brought to us. It had spent billions of dollars and countless amount of money and resources into developing world-class infrastructure. The world had come to China. But when they arrived in China, at that point of time, we are talking about the early 2000s, the condition of Beijing, the condition of those cities were very similar to the condition that you see in the northern Indian part right now. So that is when China resorted to conducting this cloud seeding and carrying out artificial rain. It did help in combating pollution, but it did bring to light a newer technology and its utility and applicability on a large scale for a first time. So that is, since that point of time, researchers have flirted with this idea of causing artificial rain. In India, you had this experiment being carried out in the Solapur region of Maharashtra. Solapur area is a comparatively drier area in the leeward side or in the rain shadow side of the Western Ghats, so does not receive much rainfall. So there, this artificial seeding was carried out, or cloud seeding was carried out. It was found out that all it could bring about is 18% of more rainfall. That's it, not much more. So the achievements, the benefits, there is a significant limitation. Right? What are the benefits? First of all, helps get rid of pollution, right? Can tackle droughts, then can help crop growth, cultivation, can help ward off forest fires, ensure water security. Right. So these things can be done. But then, why it is not being practiced all over? Because there are severe and significant disadvantages. What are the disadvantages? As I was telling you, the benefit accrued is not very clear. We don't have a substantial benefit that earlier this region was receiving 10 centimeter, but now by the artificial methods, we are inducing 100 centimeter of rainfall there. No. By artificial methods, all that you can bring about, maybe from the 10, you can bring it to 15 centimeter, not more than that. Eventually, the existing conditions on the ground, the meteorological conditions, are way more important to cause rainfall than spraying silver iodide up into air. And why is it that if it is so beneficial, why is it that this has been postponed for another week? You know why? Because, as the researchers have pointed out, that look, under normal conditions, if we carry out seeding, maybe it will rain, maybe it will not rain. What we need is the presence of westerly winds, because this is the time of western disturbance in the northern part of the country. So they say that the western disturbance is supposed to bring the clouds. In those clouds, we will spray this, and then we will increase the availability of rains. So you need certain set of conditions to prevail for this process to work. And if this process also works, the benefit is not very apparently clear. So that is a disadvantage. And if this would have been a cheap method, fair enough. You could have carried this out. But it is costly. In order to cause artificial rain in 1 square kilometer, 1 square kilometer is virtually nothing if you consider a large city landscape. 1 square kilometer, the cost incurred is close to 1 lakh rupees. So, for the phase 1 and phase 2 approval, which has been provided by the Delhi government, the cost to be incurred, which is being borne by the Delhi government, is close to around 13 to 15 crores. And that too with a limited amount of success. But on top of that, you have to understand, you are spraying silver and potassium iodide. When the raindrops will fall, they will bring those particles on the ground surface. So, in a way, it can lead to groundwater contamination, river contamination, isn't it? It can also lead to infections. It can also alter plant health. It can alter or it can impact the skin diseases. It can have a kind of a bioaccumulation or a biomagnification thereby. So it has got environmental cost also, limited advantages, high input cost. So that is why it is not being practiced. So when we talk about disadvantages, here, first of all, limited benefits, then requirement of specific meteorological system, not all clouds can be seeded. So that means limited scope as well. Then costly process, bioaccumulation, environmental damages. So these are your set of disadvantages, right? Amongst environmental damages, you can talk about contamination, accumulation, pollution, all that you can talk about. Generally, when we talk about the clouds which can be seeded, stratus clouds, I hope we are aware about the types of clouds. If not, you have certain clouds which are spread in thin layers. They are known as stratus clouds. Here, so these stratus clouds, these are not fit for the seeding. Generally, you have cumulus type of clouds which are fit for that seeding. And there you will have accumulation of crystals. Okay. And here, by the way, this here rather than meteorological system, talk about meteorological condition. Okay. Meteorological conditions such as wind pattern, type of clouds, etc. So generally, you will have only certain types of clouds which can actually be seeded. So in Delhi, it has been postponed. It will be in news even next week. So even next week, when you follow this, just understand that it will have a limited scope. For example, recent news headlines, they indicated that the anti-smog towers, which were inaugurated in Delhi with such great amount of fanfare, such great amount of publicity that it will take care of Delhi's pollution and so on. The commission or the committee has indicated that anti-smog towers are very costly to run with very limited benefit, almost no benefit at all, right? And something similar is expected here also. Pollution in Delhi is not because there is no rainfall. Pollution in Delhi is because there is emission. So unless and until we curtail, let's suppose the transportation emission, emission due to stubble burning, Punjab, again, this year also has been one of the states where the amount of stubble burning has been incredible, very high. And for that, in order to control the stubble burning in Punjab, you do need to carry out certain legislative amendments. For example, the Punjab Groundwater Act. As per the requirements of the Groundwater Act, there is a limited scope in which you can grow the crops. So that is where the farmers, they don't have enough options available rather than to burn the stubble. So that is where you need to relook your policy of agriculture. You need to relook into what needs to be done for carrying out agriculture sustainably. Only then can you control stubble burning. Then the dust emitted by construction activities, they need to be curtailed. The older industries, they need to be brought into the picture. For example, in Paris, the system is whenever the air quality index exceeds the limit of 50, immediately diesel vehicles on road, they are not allowed. Immediately there is a curtailment in the number of vehicles which can move. In Delhi, when is it that we take action? We take action when the AQI numbers, they reach around 700, 800, or even 900. Easily above 500, then we start taking action. By that point of time, already many people are suffering. So the way forward to curb pollution is not artificial seeding of clouds and artificial rain, but to control pollution at the grassroots. Okay? Now, cirrus clouds are not very significantly used for rain, no. Because in the case of cirrus clouds, by the time that the raindrops fall, there is a re-evaporation which happens, leading to a lack of rainfall. There is a chance of acid rain as well, Ramavat, that is correct. By using the method of water vapor get condensed, but our problem is pollutants, not water vapor, right? So how artificial rains help reduce pollutants in atmosphere? Because when the rainfall happens, so all the pollutants which are there, many of them, they get dissolved in that rainwater and they are carried away by the rainwater. That is how. Okay. Yes. So what are artificial rains? Discuss the advantages and the potential damages that they can cause. Pretty straightforward a question. So in the introduction part, you have to address artificial rain is carried out by cloud seeding methodology, where we induce condensation of large ice crystals by spraying particles such as silver, potassium iodide, or dry ice into the clouds to encourage condensation. That's it. Draw the schematic diagram, talk about the advantages and the potential disadvantages. Okay. Now, after that, we come to a kind of a mass exodus which has been instigated, which has been triggered from Myanmar to Mizoram. So, over the past few days, things have been unraveling real rapidly in Myanmar, as has been the case for the past few years. Sadly, it is due to this crisis, ongoing crisis, that we had a crisis in Manipur. We are suffering from a crisis in Manipur, also instigated by the problems in Myanmar. So I hope we are aware that the in Myanmar who is ruling right now. So in Myanmar you have the military which is in power and what is also referred to as the military junta, right? It does seem like junta, but it is pronounced as junta. So basically the military is in power and the military junta has grabbed power for some time now. Now, what has happened over the past few years is you have various different small groups which are identified based on their ethnicity and based upon their own individual ideology as well. So these particular guerrilla groups, many of them pro-democracy groups who basically want to overthrow this military junta government, they have virtually been clashing with the government or with the military for some time now. So basically, the ongoing conflict between the Myanmar military junta and the pro-democracy militias with ethnic organizations, they are playing a significantly crucial role. Now, recently, what has been observed that when we talk about the Indo-Myanmar border, which is close to around 1643 kilometers, now four states share the border with Myanmar. You have Arunachal, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram. Now, we have seen in the month of April, you had large scale influx of certain group of or certain ethnic group into Manipur from Myanmar, which created from Myanmar into Manipur, which has created all that disturbance, all that mistrust, all that level of polarization in Manipur because of that large influx. Right? Something similar has happened in Mizoram now. In the past few days, close to around 1,500 people have crossed over to Mizoram, including many of the people of the army as well from Myanmar. They have obviously gone back now, they have been sent back now. But this again exposes us to maybe a fresh possible set of problems. But here, why is it that people can come in and move ahead or go back so frequently? That is because of the free movement regime which exists in these particular four states, which is regarded as an open border as well. You don't have a fencing which has been done. Now it is being carried out given what has happened in Manipur, given our experience in Manipur. Now, obviously, over the next couple of decades, the governments in power will focus on fencing this eastern border as well. But in order to help the ethnic people or the people in this area, the local community in this area, because the local community and ethnicities, they share their homes on both sides of the border, right? So in order to allow them that cultural assimilation, the people to people connect, that free movement regime had been brought into, which is a mutually agreed or the mutually agreed arrangement where the tribes of the region, they are allowed to travel up to 16 kilometers inside on either side of the border without a visa, without requirement of a visa. So people generally move in to and fro. Now, in this method, previously, this has been exploited by antisocial elements to basically push in a lot of drugs into India, lot of contraband arms, and various different materials are smuggled into India by this. Whenever you have such large scale influx of refugees, that creates social problem in that region per se, but also that problem can spill out in the neighboring region. And when you have a region such as which is still boiling like Manipur, Mizoram can never be taken lightly. Now, near Mizoram, you have the border town on the side of Myanmar. So, the province of Myanmar, near this area, this is the Chin province. This is the where you have the Chin community, Kuki Chin community, right? So Chin province, where you have the Kuki Chins, which are in large majority. So here you have a border town, that is Phalam. So that border town basically has now been overcome. So there is an increased risk. On one side, the junta government and the military junta on one side has been very adamant that no, we are not pushing anyone. But on the sidelines, you have the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China, also supplying contraband arms and smuggling these arms to create disturbance in India through this route. So it has been an issue. But here, when we talk about the issues in brief, so refugee influx into Mizoram can create a social problem in that area. Obviously, there is always an issue of the insiders versus outsiders. People start getting threatened. We saw what happened with the Kukis and the Maitis in Manipur. Now, Myanmar ongoing civil war has the prospect to spill over into Mizoram also. Because, as per the reports, there had been bombings very close to the border area, and multiple different magistrates had been rushed to the border town and the border villages. But thankfully, nothing happened on this side. But it can easily spill over. And whenever it spills over, it will lead to a large scale migration. Now, various different ethnic organizations having different diverse responses to the junta government, they have their own ideological functionality. So, in order to gain their legitimacy, they carry on that drugs trade, illegal arms, which can be a nuisance and disturbance to India's internal security as well. So that is a major issue. We don't have a particular refugee policy. We don't know how to deal with refugees, right? So what should be our way forward? How should we tackle this problem? First of all, sensitization of the citizenry to avoid polarization of the masses. The citizenry has to be made aware that the people who have come here out of no option left. It is not their choice that today let's go and live in Manipur or Mizoram. That is not why they have left Myanmar. They were driven out. When the conditions generally they get back to normal, because as far as the memory goes, in the case of Myanmar, whenever there has been a kind of an oppression by the junta, always there has been a migrant issue created in the northeastern states. And again, when the junta government basically takes a backseat, again those people migrate back to Myanmar. So once the citizenry is aware that this is a temporary issue, they will be much more compassionate rather than being up in arms against each other. We need to carry out refugee management. We need to ensure that we identify who are the people who have come from Myanmar and who are the people who are the local inhabitants. Given the fact that the tribes and the ethnicities they share that area, it is a difficult task at hand, but it needs to be addressed, it needs to be achieved with utmost urgency. And we need to have a model law on refugees and asylum seekers. We don't have a kind of a model law dealing with that. That if you have sudden refugee influx, what are the basic necessities that you need to provide to them? We need to have a plan for that. It is a different matter that India has been taking refugees ever since the time of independence. We have been welcoming refugees, but that is purely on compassionate grounds. We don't have a policy document in place that if the refugees come in, we have to enumerate these details. This is where we'll keep them. This is how we'll provide them shelter. This is where we'll provide them healthcare facilities. This is where they will be given some education facilities or the basic requirements. We don't have that policy at all. What that leads to is a kind of a subjective action. Somewhere some action is taken, somewhere some facilities are provided, somewhere no facilities are provided. And that always leads to a local discontent, which immediately brews into a political opportunism for that particular region, and it blows out of proportion. So, in the coming weeks, as this issue develops, you have to understand that what happened in Manipur or what is happening in Manipur can easily be replicated in other states if we are not careful about handling this refugee and large scale influx of refugee in these critical areas where people are very, very sensitive about the background and also the ethnicity. So it has to be handled with utmost care. Okay. Does India need a policy on migration? Discuss. So here you have to talk about the various different issues that why India does require a policy for migration, right? So because we need to understand that even the migrants who come in, they also have the human rights requirement. Their human rights need to be addressed. Their human rights need to be respected, fulfilled, and basic necessities need to be addressed. Okay. Now, then after that, we come to the second last topic, and that is where we are going to talk about the Indo-Australian 2+2 dialogue. Okay, and Kanchan, I am from Manipur. These migration has been happening for so many years. This particular tribe, Cookies, started doing poppy cultivation, receiving military arms and destroying our forests by poppy cultivation. Damage is so bad, and they are using the tribal cards to get the cookie land, killing so many innocent Maitis. The government of India should think about its citizens and tackle the illegal migrants. Right. That is what I have said, that basically we need to address that the local citizenry, they should never feel alienated by the influx of the migrants. And for that, you need to keep track of who are your migrants, who are your local citizenry. That needs to be addressed first of all. Okay. And then what do we write in intro, Pallavi, for that, for this question, does India need a policy on migration? You talk about the brief background that India has always been welcoming to the immigrants or to the refugees, but it has not had a distinct policy at hand, because that is thought to be, or that has been thought by the policymakers to limit India's own role in carrying out the humanitarian missions. That will be your intro in itself. Okay. Sabah, I'm not able to look at your question right now. I'll take a look at it as soon as it is visible. Now, Indo-Australian 2+2 dialogue, it is being conducted, and it goes on today also. It was carried out yesterday also. So basically, this 2+2 dialogue, India carries out with only few nations of the world. Recently, the Indo-US 2+2 dialogue was basically concluded. Other than that, India carries 2+2 with Russia and Japan, right? So that is also relevant for your prelims. Okay, so it carries out the 2+2 with US, Russia, Japan, and Australia. Okay, now what is 2+2? You have specific meetings with generally the foreign and the defense minister along with their counterparts on the other side, to and the purpose of it is to have a kind of a unified focus, a specific focus on areas and sectors which require intervention, which require support in order to carry out the development. So here it is centered around the deepening of the military cooperation in various different critical technologies as well. For example, even in military parlance, you have various infrastructural and logistical support which are being worked out, including anti-submarine warfare, which is very, very critical as of now. In the times when we are observing, when you are witnessing news headlines where the Chinese submarine force is very close to becoming amongst the larger and the largest submarine force in the world, and the Chinese being able to develop the most modern kind of submarine technology, which even the US has not managed to develop right now, we do need this critical military cooperation. And that is where Australia is of immense help, because Australia, unlike the case of Japan and US, which are our members in Quad, Australia shares the same region of Indo-Pacific. So it does share the same concern, right? Air-to-air refueling that allows for a greater military reach beyond your own borders. So you can get an aircraft flying from the region of Nicobar Islands, getting refueled in the meanwhile from maybe a kind of an air support from Australia. That reach of that aircraft, maybe for anti-submarine warfare, can reach as far as the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait as well, right? Security in the vast Indo-Pacific region and China's rising influence. That has been talked about in significant detail. Hydrographic cooperation, strengthening cooperation in sectors of critical tech, space, education, and science and tech. So these are the areas under which the 2 plus 2 dialogue is being held. Now, India and Australia, they don't share the warmest of the relationships because up until the Cold War, both of them, they lied in, or they were basically perceived to be lying in opposite camps. Australia, since the very initial days, has been strongly in the US camp, so to say, or has been a very strong and staunch US ally, right? So much so that US has basically time and again deployed a lot of military personnel in the region of Australia ever since the Second World War itself, and before that also. That cooperation with Australia had always been there. But when it comes to India, we basically had to move to increase our relationship with the Soviets in order to bolster our defense requirements, in order to fulfill our defense demands. So we were always we we were thought to be in the opposite camp, so the relationship never developed quite significantly. Now, for almost 30 years before 2014, you did not have, after late Prime Minister Sri Rajiv Gandhi, no Prime Minister had visited Australia. And in the meanwhile, you had a lot of people, especially students and the young population of India, migrating to Australia in order to carry out better education, in order to carry out their future in economic opportunities, and also for low skilled jobs. So that is what the out migration from India into Australia and Canada is, the low skilled jobs, where the low skilled jobs, they pay you significantly, and where the requirement of education degrees is not so much, so you get easy employment. So you have a lot of Indians migrating there. So slowly and steadily, the Indian community in Australia had started increasing in size, in numbers, and you did not have a high level visit happening to Australia. That changed in 2014 when you had the Prime Minister visit in Australia taking place, and you had the cricket diplomacy phase. And after that, Australia has been partnering India even for supply of certain very critical available minerals such as uranium. Now, even for that uranium supply, India has been banking on Australia, and Australia is very rich in minerals. Even, for example, for the supply of coal, the kind of coal that you get from Australia, that is not the coal that you find in India. That is why you had Adani Group setting a coal mine in the Carmichael coal mines in the Queensland province of Australia, which later ran into obstacles and was stripped off. So, if that is where the cooperation is increasing, from a low of history, it is increasing. And this is a strategic partnership. We basically converge in with Australia in terms of our strategic goals about how the region should be. We follow the same principles of international law and order, international freedom of movement of for trade and practices, right? And we share our similar concerns. We have Quad. We are both are members of Quad, right? People to people connect is significant. Trade relations have been increasing quite significantly. Even though Australia's export to India is larger, but Indian exports to Australia has witnessed almost 100% increase in the past few years. So we have been exporting billions of dollars of merchandise to Australia as well. Now, free trade agreement and CECA, that is Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, that is being talked about, that is being finalized, right? And it is basically thought, and what is basically being estimated, that this 2 plus 2 dialogue is a precursor for that eventual signing of free trade agreement with Australia, which can happen in January 2024, when the Quad leaders might meet for a summit, when we might have a visit of the Australian Prime Minister. So that is where the the relationship has got a lot of potential moving ahead into the future. And the governments have taken different initiatives on their own as well. So, for example, foreign ministerial framework dialogue in order to coordinate on foreign policy matters leading to international diplomacy, issues of international diplomacy, the 2 plus 2, CECA and FTA convergence over Quad. So the government is initiating various different processes to increase the cooperation with Australia. However, there are a bit of concerns as well. For example, the recent uprising or uproar in Canada over one of the killings which happened in Canada, where Canadian government blamed India for that. Now, Australia was seen backing the Canadian government. Australia is a part of the Five Eyes, the group of the intelligence communities across this world who basically share that intelligence. So, Australia, rather than backing India, was seen to be backing Canada, which is a concern. But India basically, as per its foreign policy doctrine, India is only concerned about what Indo Australian relations are. India is not concerned about what Canada has got a role to play in Indo Australian relationships. So that is where there is a lot of things that will be achieved, that eventually have been achieved in this relationship, and much more important are the critical minerals. We lack critical minerals and the tech associated with critical minerals, and Australia is endowed with that. So that is why India needs that trade agreement. Even the merchandise export that happens from India that faces various tariff barriers, and there also the free trade agreement will be helpful. Where the sticking point comes is that Australia wants lower duty structures on some of its agricultural products, on the wines that it exports to India. Australia wants a lower taxation structure. So that is the impediment that the countries are trying to work upon. Okay, so discuss the geopolitical relevance of Indo-Australian relationship. So here, Indo-Australian relationship, which is established more upon the democratic values and the shared values of global governance that we share, and cemented upon by the people to people connect with increasing Indian diaspora in Australia and increased trade and tourism between these areas, is set to grow and is set to be one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. That will be your introduction. Then you have to talk about the concerns that both these countries share, including the international norms of law and order, including China's wolf warrior diplomacy, including military tech and military cooperation, including education, including intervention in health. All these factors you have to talk about. Then you have to talk about how these both countries can ensure a peaceful Indo-Pacific going ahead into the future. Okay. Now, after that, we come to the last topic of the day. I'll take around 5-7 minutes more of your time. The last topic of the day is about the US China summit. So, to say, it was not a summit, it was basically a summit because Joe Biden met with Xi Jinping in San Francisco on the backdrop of the APEC summit. And basically, despite calling Xi Jinping a dictator again, both of them appeared to share quite a good bonhomie, at least in front of the cameras. Right? So, this was the world's largest powers coming face to face in order to resolve their issues, in order to have a kind of a workable relationship. Now, this particular meeting has got a lot of things that it teaches us as well, and a lot of implications for us Indians as well. So basically, recent summit meeting between the US president and the Chinese president in San Francisco, despite unlikely to resolve major differences, has shown promise in stabilizing the rocky relationship between the two global powers. And it is also not the first time where US has basically significantly worked in order to improve the relationship with the growing power that is China. This is nothing but identification and, in a way, coming of China on the global stage. This is what China wants, to be identified as almost an equal to the US. Now, here, this the both these countries, they have a lot of issues which turn out to be a prickly affair between them. And the issues are basically a trade war, which is almost ensuing almost on a daily basis. US bans certain products, China bans certain products. But do you know what is the trade? What is the trade volume between these two countries? Are we aware about the trade volume between these countries? No? Any clue? It is close to more than $750 billion as per the estimate of 2022. trade volume as per 2022 more than 750 billion US dollars. So you can imagine how huge that trade is. So no country can afford to immediately disrupt the trade. But there has been suspicion. And that suspicion started with the case of the spying, where you had the Chinese balloon, which was moving over US, which was shot down by the US military. You had a couple of balloons being shot down in a span of few days. And that increased the tensions between these countries. US till now maintains that China was using it for spying purposes. China, as always, is the most innocent, only studying atmospheric phenomena, and had ventured across the Pacific and had entered into the US. So that is where the distrust or the mistrust has always been there. When it comes to 5G technology, US did not allow Huawei, one of the Chinese giants, to participate in that because US has a strong suspicion backed by certain evidences that by that China allows spying to happen. And also, China has been alleged to steal critical tech and critical technology and information from US time and time again. So that is why there's a lot of mistrust between them. There's a strategic divergence in terms of point of opinion. For example, China is supplying arms to Russia. US is supplying arms to Ukraine. So in a way, you can think about it that both of them are fueling the war, both of them are benefiting out of this war, and both of them are not fighting each other. So in a way, it is kind of a reversal to the Cold War technique that I will give this particular or resources to this particular person, you give resources to that particular person, let them fight over, let's see whose weapons win. So that is where there is a strategic divergence. China historically has been supporting those countries, which US has not aligned with. And even their policy divergence exists in the matter such as Taiwan, where US even today stands steadfast on the matter of Taiwanese independence, but China opposes that. China is not ready to take that at all. That is why you have frequent military incursions from the each other's military with respect to each other. Now, in the summit, Xi Jinping actually made a very beautiful statement. He said that the world is big enough for both US and China to coexist. So that basically demarcates a willingness on the side of China. But there, China's have always been a very, very tough negotiators. Chinese, they never back down from the negotiation table. So there also they are expecting US to back down. For example, recently US had imposed certain trade barriers and restrictions on the Chinese import of certain semiconductors, right? And which were thought to be of critical tech. So what China has done, the Chinese companies, they have basically shifted their base and they are now shipping those materials individually. They are still shipping those materials from US, but they are doing it under the table. So that has created a lot of problems. Now, what is the learning for India? The learning for India from this is just like how China and US, despite all their problems, they have managed to come on the dialogue table, managed to come in front of each other to resolve that. Eventually, that is the way to go. You cannot stare someone down like China into submission that, we are so strong, you should basically submit before us and you should agree to all our demands. You have to eventually go for the negotiating table. And also, more importantly, one portion of what has become a trademark policy of China's foreign policy affairs for past 2 to 3 decades, if you observe, one part of dispute is not allowed to take over the entire relationship. So China has always advocated to India that, look, we understand that we have a border dispute, let the normal trade be carried on. The problem that was instigated in Galwan incident was that it was a level too high, where India could simply not tolerate it anymore. So that is where we have to talk about with China about what is the way forward. We have to go for a higher summit level meetings. And that is where a political consensus is very much required. But the impact of it geopolitically, globally, now globally, it has got both positive as well as negative impacts, both for India and the region also. What are the positive impacts? So, when we talk about positive impacts, the positive impact can be that when the world is less fractured, when there is less tension, there will be increase in trade, global trade. When there is an increase in trade, it will always be beneficial for the global community, and producing countries like India also will benefit out of it, right? So Indian economy will also grow. There will be better economic prospect. There will be peaceful international trade which can be carried out, right? So you can have peaceful coexistence, convergence on important matters like climate change. Global governance will be strengthened. Yes, that also you can write, right? So there you have these positives, but there is negative also. For example, ever since that relation between US and China and Western countries and China has been growing fraught, India has seen this and the world has seen this as India's opportunity. Various different countries are flocking to India as an alternative. So if China again becomes a kind of a neutral market where China is not antagonistic to the US and the Western countries anymore, so all that investment which is supposed to come to India can again route back to China. It can also lead to marginalization. What happened in the late 70s? In the late 70s, after you had the meeting between the US and China in 76, India was almost marginalized from the area. So that can also happen, right? India might be left to fend on its own in the critical northern and eastern borders. So that is where we need to be very, very careful, right? And with US on its side, China or US not creating a problem anymore, US won't ever be on its side, but US not creating a significant problem anymore, China can push forward with encircling India with the kind of a string of pearls strategy that it has always done. So there are alarm bells, but there are also positive notes created due to this meeting, and there are learnings that India can also gain from this meeting. Now, something relevant for your prelims out of this, that is APEC. So, what is APEC? Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, established in 1989. It is a regional forum for growth in economic trade and growth in regional economies as well. You have 21 member economies who are a part of it: Australia, Brunei, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Hong Kong as a part of China, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, Taipei, then China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, Canada, US, Mexico, Peru, and Chile. That is the entire region around the Pacific. The entire circle that you draw around the Pacific, talk about the countries there, list them one by one, they are partners of it. Now, the question: discuss the implication of the US China summit on India. So, here in the introduction, talk about the recently conducted US China summit where both the leaders met on the sidelines of the APEC summit in San Francisco, where they agreed to resolve their issues and resolve the issues amicably. After that, implications on the world, implications on India also, both positive as well as negative. Eventually, you have to talk about how the way forward is the way of dialogue, the way of engaging with the political class, finding a political solution, and ensuring people to people contact also. Okay, so that is what you have to write there, and I hope you understood the portion of answer writing. I hope that was taken in with some amount of understanding. I hope and suggest that you write the answers also, and I hope the entire session was helpful to you. You have gained something out of it and you have added some value to it. Please try to revise it as soon as possible. And overall, APEC is basically Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, a forum or a kind of economic forum established where you have trade practices and the economic cooperation being discussed. Okay, so that will be all from my side here, guys. Till we meet again, do take care of yourself. In case any of your doubts remain unanswered, please don't worry. Feel free to get in touch with us. Do write to us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. That will be all from my side. Do take care of yourself. Goodbye. Sleep well. Good night. Thank you.